Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read Transcendent Kingdom by Yaa Gyasi. This fiction novel was released in 2020, and it was published by YNG Books. It's the tragic tale of addiction through the eyes of a preteen for most of the story. Gifty, our main character, is a child of Ghanaian immigrants, and she reflects from her current position as a PhD candidate to the life that she had when she was younger. Now, before we get into the book, Yaa Gyasi released her debut novel, Homegoing, in 2016, which essentially put her on the map as a writer. It won her the John Leonard Award for Best First Book, the Hemingway Award for First Fiction Book, and she was actually named one of the 5 under 35 for the 2016 American Book Awards. So I have a feeling that we'll be seeing more of her in the future. She was also published in the Callaloo, the Guardian, and the African American Review. So this is someone who I fully expect to read more of their work in the future. The style of this book is descriptive and narrative. Now we get the first person narration by Gifty, who is again our main character, and I would go farther to say it's essentially a psychoanalysis by Gifty. She's able to display the emotions surrounding a lot of the tragic things she went through without kind of giving the audience a gut-wrenching reaction. And by that, I mean, sometimes when books cover heavy topics, of course it's heavy, but you don't want it to be so terrible that the audience literally cannot read through another page. And this is something that Gyasi she essentially, perfected it, because it was a heavy topic, but I never once thought about not reading or completing the rest of the book. With that being said, though, the tone is melancholy. That's it, This is a story of the character arcs of Gifty's mother and brother, and it surrounds, addiction and depression. But I want to say that the tone, although it is very sad, it's not hopeless at all. Now, again, through the perspective of Gifty, we are told her story, and I've kind of described it as it's like transposing / overlapping the stories of her childhood, the times before and after her brother overdosed, as well as her academic life and her present day, where she is an adult and she's navigating the world still with these emotions intact. So along with that, we also get a lot of information on her science experiments, which I wasn't expecting. I learned a lot though, but that is also woven in, throughout the fabric of this book. The structure is very straightforward. There are very short chapters, I would say, especially at the beginning, and they're kind of, a few pages long, and that's really where we see the 3 separate worlds that she is discussing, whether she's reflecting on, her past life, or she's talking about now. And towards the end of the book, we kind of see all of them merge together and understand the full chronological timeline. Now, within the chapters, we also have a few journal entries from her childhood journal that it explains what she was feeling when she was a child, and then it's usually followed by some sort of reflection or context in the present. And so we're able to see the clear line of how her emotions as a child have either transformed or grown or matured, as she got older. And then, of course, we have the acknowledgement section at the end of the book. So Gifty, our main character, is a phenomenal woman. First of all, she's very strong, and she draws her motivation mainly from a sense of competition. And really, the only competition she has is herself. She's trying to conquer these demons, the shame that surrounds her family members, not her. But in that, she's driven to find a solution for addiction, specifically in depression. And you can kind of argue that she's really working towards a better understanding of mental illness as a whole. She also has this kind of cross between her scientific mind, but also philosophy based, because she's always asking why. And so we see that when you kind of bring that together, that's true science right there. You don't just study what is already known and out there. You have to really question things. And lastly, she's a character that is unemotional by design, but she's not emotionless. She's just someone who has been through a lot. And also, as a child, emotions weren't really a big thing in her family. But when it comes to the reader's side of this, we're able to see the story through a clearer lens with a bit more objectiveness. Because as we know, when you have a first-person book, you always have to take it with a grain of salt, because the character has some sort of unconscious, subconscious bias, towards the story, because they don't know everything. But with Gifty, we're able to see, a pretty clear picture, and that's due to, the absence of emotions. Now, the other characters, their stories are important, but we're going to talk about how they affect Gifty. So Nana is Gifty's brother, and he represents addiction. So this is where the motivation behind Gifty's career ultimately lays. And it's also, the catalyst for the unraveling of, her mother, who went into a state of very deep depression. And again, that's another motivation behind her career, is to find the causes of these things. Why do we react a certain way to substances? Why can't we say no? Things like that. And then the Chin Chin Man, which is Gifty's father, that's what she calls him, represents an absence and an abandonment. After a while, you kind of forget about her dad, because he's not in the picture, for the entire story. And you could go with the well-known that affected her future romantic relationships. But I think more than anything, what we see through him is a different side of grief. Even prior to his son passing, he just was not having it in America. He wasn't having a happy life. He had his family, but he himself was going through something. And so his response to that was to seek refuge at home in Ghana. Now, with Gifty's mother, there's an interesting dynamic there, because she is someone who is essentially alone. And you could argue by the end of this book that all of the main characters that we were looking at are all sort of alone in their own way. But Gifty's mom lost Nana. It was a physical loss, it was a permanent loss, and it was unexpected, in the words of Gifty. But she also lost Gifty because it was a natural progression involving both of their grief. And it was slow, and it was more of a mental loss. And so her and her mother are in the same room for a good portion of this book and don't even really interact with each other for the most part. Grief is the primary theme throughout this book. The mother is trapped in the fourth stage of grief, which is depression. She can't get past that stage. However, we do see her go through the first few stages, which are denial, anger, and bargaining. When we were looking at Nana's addiction, when he first got into substance abuse, we saw all of those stages played out. We just didn't recognize, what was happening, because we, weren't aware yet. Now, acceptance is the fifth stage, and it's something that Gifty and her mom should strive for. I don't know if you can really argue if her mom is trying for anything, But Gifty, of course, her answer to finding her acceptance of her situation is through science. And I would argue to say that the title of the book, Transcendent Kingdom, represents the ultimate acceptance of things that are ultimately uncontrolled. Which brings us to the last theme, which is the intersectionality of science and religion. So science plays a large part in this book because it's Gifty's career path. She's in neuroscience. She's conducting experiments, for her PhD. And one thing that stuck with me was how she described the hardest part of experimenting was figuring out the question to challenge your assumption. So we all know, if you've ever done a simple experiment or a complex one, what you want the results to be or what maybe you're expecting to see, but how do you really get there? How do you change your view of things, whether you introduce another aspect or whatever may have you? But that is also reflected through her real life because her mother and hers relationship is very experimental. They really don't know how to be, I would say, a typical American mother-daughter. They don't have that dynamic. They don't really have a dynamic outside of the grief that ties them together. It almost seems like they are strangers. They don't really interact very well. Whereas with her actual experiment, she is testing on mice and she's testing desire and restraint and how those things can be controlled possibly or induced or stopped, however you want to put that. Now, religion, this is of course the notion that God has this path for all of us and all events are set in stone. So what's going to happen, it's going to happen and it's meant to happen. What happens is this creates resentment in people who are religious and who have unfortunate things that happen to them because it's difficult to reconcile that something terrible that happened to you was supposed to happen and it's meant to happen. You don't really want to think about that because then it's kind of like, oh, well, I didn't really have control over the situation. There was nothing I can do. That's a tough pill to swallow. In theory, you can say that, we're all on God's path and we're all, we're going to be okay. But as soon as something terrible happens, it's really difficult to hold on to that. And that's what we see in Gifty when she was dealing with Nana's death. A clear example of the point of contention between science and religion is evolution. So in the book, when we talk about sides, if you're on the science side or the religion side, this question came up. How can both of these theories be true? They can't. You have to pick a side. So whether you think the Big Bang Theory happened or you think God, created everything, depending on how you answer that question depicted which side you were on, whether that meant you were a quote-unquote Jesus freak or you were a scientific scholar who would never, allow themselves to be brought into the religious cult, quote-unquote. And what we see is Gifty kind of plays along that line. And again, if you go back to my first couple of points about her, she's someone who questions why a lot, but she's also someone who is conditioned to look at the facts. She's a scientist, and so she doesn't believe that you have to choose one or the other. She stands in the middle and she pulls, from both sides in order to create the bigger picture. And I like that this book didn't lead up to her choosing one or the other, because religion was a very important aspect of her childhood. Even when she spent a brief summer in Africa, religion was still heavy there. And it's interesting how similar that is to the American Bible Belt where she was in Alabama. And so seeing her, I kind of felt like that's what it was building up towards, like this girl that was, raised with this godly spirit, went to church every Sunday. Then something tragic happened, and so now she's going to kind of turn that off, and I was glad to see that wasn't the case. And lastly, with motif, what I really pulled from this was the emotional connections that Gifty was or was not able to have and build with the people around her. And this included, her relationship with her father, her mother, her brother, but also romantic relationships. How she connected to people was really impaired by probably, again, her grief process. She wasn't really able to see past her goal to solve this issue of addiction and to get her mother out of depression and to make her feel better. Now, with that being said, before we jump into the review, I do want to say there are a few other themes in this book. Obviously, there's the conversation about being an immigrant in Alabama, all of the racism that they had to deal with. But I wanted to pull from the character herself. And even though the character is a Black woman, she's someone who is the child of immigrants. That wasn't her sole identity. It played a large part in it, but that's why I didn't include it here. I think this book was more a story on grief, if you ask me. But, read the book and find out for yourself. I got this one actually at Target, so I'm pretty sure you can get it pretty easily. If you can't find it in stores, it's online. Now, when it comes to my review, so the Seattle Times on the back of the book described it in part, as a redemptive American story. I think that this story doesn't really have redemption, because that implies that something was wrapped up. Some conclusion was written out. And it really just wasn't that simple. It was the continuation of healing and learning. And I really enjoyed that because it's more realistic. It's not like, oh, okay, well, she's happy now at the end of the book. No, that's not really how it works. In my opinion, the ending was very, it was clear, but it was unclear, because we got a clear picture of where exactly she was and, where she was in her career at the end, but we don't really know, like, mentally how she's doing. And I enjoyed that aspect of it because I kind of got to make up scenarios in my own head. But just the idea that the heavy topics were described, through the past scenarios and her current reflections and her ability, Gifty's ability to be objective, and probably not intentionally. It was because she was so stunted as far as emotions go. You were able to see the picture clearly. However, my emotions still took over. I cried, I think, 3 times. And it was mainly when she was talking about when she was younger. Because just when you hear about how a child tries to help the people around them, even though they're a child, they shouldn't even be in this situation, that just tugged on my heartstrings a little bit. But I don't think this is a sad tale, but it's just one experience, one part of the American experience, I will say, because this is certainly something, when we talk about addiction, that has affected a lot of people across America. But then also the story of being an immigrant and coming to this country hoping for better and having to work your behind off, work twice as hard as everyone around you, get treated terribly just to make ends meet. And then to see, hopefully your children thrive and go off and do great things. And, that story, I think, is something that needs to be told more, because the perception of immigrants is really slanted and biased and kind of seen through hate-filled glasses. But I do think that this is a story that it's refreshing, because I have not read anything like this before. And it's something that needs to be told. I think a lot of people can connect with the characters in the book, or, they can learn a little something. I enjoyed, I think, Gifty and her discussions within herself just about why things are the way that they are, and her just essentially, the psychoanalysis, the philosophy lectures that she has. I thought it was interesting because growing up, and especially if you go to college and you start learning more about different people and outside cultures, we go back and forth in our beliefs. So I enjoy that aspect of Gifty's character. So is this a reread? Yes. You know, if anything, I can learn a little bit more about neuroscience because there were a lot of terms that I skipped over reading because it was just a lot. But that's the character. You know, to her, this is normal to be thinking about these things. But again, I also think it just induces philosophical conversation. So I'm here for it. I'm definitely going to keep this one and read it again. So, my one takeaway from this book is that Gifty is an exceptional character who represents progression of personal thought. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Yaa Gyasi. I don't know if I'm saying your name right, and I'm sorry if I'm not, but I really enjoyed this book, and I'm certainly going to pick up Homegoing and then look forward to whatever else she puts out in the future. And before we leave, I wanted to shout out an organization from my hometown called the Black Seed Scholarship. And that's what they're called on Instagram, at the Black Seed Scholarship. So I encourage everyone to donate, just a few dollars. The money goes to graduating seniors from my hometown in Delaware that are going off to college. If anyone has been to college, you know how expensive everything is. So I really enjoy the fact that, people I know and people I went to high school with are trying to help the next generation of students get a better foot in the door. Even if it's just, a few dollars, that could help with book money, or that could help feed them for the night or something. So I really encourage everyone to go to at the Black Seed Scholarship on Instagram to just learn more about it. And then if you can, donate some money. So with that being said, thank you so much for tuning into another episode. I will see you all next week. Have a great weekend.